Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the Apostate Prophet. How is everyone doing? I am here today with Jay Dyer, a very, very special guest. Uh, Jay, do you like my intro music?
I do. I'm having to turn you off because I had you already going in the background. So,
Oh, yeah.
so I'm getting a double dose of you and the music, and so it's like a remix. But yeah,
That's
nice.
amazing. That's amazing. That must sound even better. Uh, this is basically like the Islamic humming that they always play,
That's what I
pathetically
thought. Yeah.
remixed and made much better. It would be much better if it always sounded like this, but they just don't get it. So, Jay, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. We had a good chat the other day on my channel, and you brought up a lot of good issues and kind of probably stuff that was old hat to you, but it's good to go through that stuff because maybe a lot of my audience might not know a lot of that kind of old hat classic stuff that you know. So yeah, you brought a lot of interesting insights. One thing I'd like to say from the outset was a lot of people got mad or fussed, a lot of Muslims and even a few Christians, that you and I would have these conversations. And it's odd to me because first thing, whether you're Muslim or atheist or Christian or whatever, we should all be aware of fallacies and what they are. And the genetic fallacy is one of the more well-known fallacies because it doesn't matter what source an argument comes from. The argument either stands or falls on its own. So it doesn't matter who says the argument. If Judas says an argument, it has nothing to do with his betrayal, whether that argument is true or false, right? Likewise, and you would think people would know this, likewise, the only case that I can think of in which we would consider somebody's character in an argument is if the argument was about that person's character or if they committed a crime or something like that. In that case, it would be appropriate to investigate their character. But the basis of their arguments, the validity, the arguments themselves, none of that has anything to do with the person's character and their beliefs. And it's odd to me that people don't understand that. But as I'm beginning to realize, I think this is like my fifth or sixth Islamic debate, fallacies seem to be something that a lot of Muslims are not aware of.
Yeah, precisely. I agree with everything you said there, pretty much. And you will see this every single time when you have a debate with Muslims. Most Muslims, Muslim apologists, you will encounter the same complaints all the time. If you genuinely want to discuss this topic, then you shouldn't talk to this person, shouldn't talk to that person, shouldn't talk to this other guy. Only talk to us, only discuss with us. People who criticize Islam are unreliable, and if you talk to them, that means that you are automatically marked as somebody who has no genuine interest in debating, and you must be shunned at all costs. And that's understandable, considering that criticizing Islam is not allowed, and especially me as an ex-Muslim, I'm not even supposed to exist in Daniel Kikichu's worldview. Like, he told me when we were talking, he basically told me that he thinks I should be executed for my leaving Islam. So it is really Islam is unique, and Muslims are unique in that way, where they very often just have to invoke that fallacy without understanding the problem that it presents. As said, when we talk about the whole issue with the name of God, Yahweh, in Islam versus Abrahamic biblical religion, he chooses to now completely ignore the point, even when you bring it up, simply because you reference me, or because you make a reference to what he said to me. And when he talked to me about it, he clearly had no clue. And later he denied what he actually said. He basically blasphemed and then later denied what he actually said.
It's surprising because everybody can see the clip. And, he clearly says it's a pagan name. And then when asked about that, he says, I never said that. So, it's like this is multiple times now where I'm really questioning, is he disingenuous, right? Because, I mean, if you have a person on record saying it, it's really difficult to then rewrite the history and say, no, I never said that, but you did say that. So at least you could either own up to it and say, well, I said that, but here's what I meant, or here's a clarification. But to outright just, oh, I never said that. I'm noticing a pattern of, and this is not to say that Christians are always honest. People in any position can be dishonest. You can be an atheist, be dishonest. You can be a Christian, be dishonest. You can be a Muslim and be dishonest. But there seems to be, as you noted, a kind of a tendency to shun the rational discourse, shun the logical argumentation. And again, I'm not an expert on Islam. I'm still in the process of learning. To me, it looks like there's a tendency to, when you have this going back to the original pure Islam, which is what my understanding of Daniel's school, what it represents, there's a tendency again to have to shun logic, to have to shun argumentation, because that's seen as a later development. Kalam is a later development, and that might lead to problems, right? Because there might be questions that are not permitted to ask. I remember in the when I was preparing for the Azra Rashid debate, we found some of those old Sunni texts, which, even though they were engaged in Kalam, one of the texts dealt with the names of Allah and the attributes. And there was a point where the question is raised, well, how do we reconcile the fact of God, or of Allah's pure unity, with the fact that we're naming many names? And what about the distinction between the names? And at a certain point, it says it is not permitted to ask this question. Yeah. So it's just sort of like, you can debate and discuss to a certain point, then it's not permitted. And as you were saying, the idea that there's this unity about Islamic theology is not true. At one point in the debate, Daniel's trying to say, Christians disagree. There's debates. There's this, there's that. Wait a minute. I mean, you guys don't agree. You guys have all kinds of. So in other words, if disagreements made a position true or false, no position would be true or false. I mean, yeah, they would need, because none of them would be true. Because now, if some sort of majority opinion, or if the fact that we have, 30% of the Islamic schools agree about this position, 60% agree with this position, I mean, none of that has anything to do with whether it's true or false. It's another fallacy to appeal to majority, appeal to consensus. You can certainly bring in experts, but expert testimony itself doesn't necessarily prove a thing. And so I just, over and over and over, I hear these appeals that were very similar to, fallacies that I've seen in other debates, that when I would bring them up, you could tell that he didn't even know what I was referencing. What do you mean?
Yeah. There was this very awkward moment that I saw, actually multiple awkward moments about the very same thing during the debate that you had with Daniel Kikichu, which was where you brought up the idea that the Quran tells Jews and Christians that they should read their own book, and it says that their book is confirmed. But if you go to that book, then you have the problem of somebody like Daniel Kikichu saying, okay, but those books are invalid because they have contradictions and they were corrupted. And so you are caught in this whole dilemma. Okay, are those books now confirmed and authentic, or are they not? And he then comes in and presents this position, which is the best he can do, because it is just, it's a whole problem that Muslims can't get out of. He then tells you that when the Jews and Christians go to those books, they will see contradictions in those books with monotheism as presented in Islam, which is why they will understand that those books are wrong. Okay, but that means that they have to evaluate that whole situation from Islam's perspective, which doesn't make sense. And
yeah, if what's in question is the continuity of the Quran with previous revelation, then I asked a very simple question to Daniel, which was, what is the epistemic principle that you have that tells you when the Old Testament is true and when it's false? And he says the Quran. But the thing is that that's what's in question. So you can't just appeal to the thing in question when we're asking about prior revelation. Now, you could say, but Jay, what you did in the debate, you said, but Jay, you appealed to the Old Testament too in terms of your position. Yeah, but I don't argue that the Old Testament has a lot of contradictions. So if I thought the Old Testament had contradictions and Christianity was the new revelation that replaced it, I would be in the same boat as Daniel's position, you see.
Yeah.
Because you could say, well, the New Testament appeals to the Old Testament. Right. But it never makes the appeal that the Old Testament is true and valid, but it also has contradictions. That's Daniel's position. Daniel's position that the Old Testament is true and valid because the Quran says so. However, there's all these passages that don't teach the pure monotheism of Islam. And I still have that drawing here that I had drawn up, the famous whiteboard here. So these are just examples of theophanies where we find real distinctions in God in the Old Testament. And there's more. This is just one list that I could fit on one board. And Daniel says, yeah, those are problem texts that are all contradictions. Now, wait a minute. That's why I asked the question, well, then what's the epistemic principle that tells you when you go through the Old Testament, oh, this is a true verse, false verse, true verse, false verse. This chapter true, this chapter false, this chunk true, this chunk false. And the principle was whatever's consistent with the Quran. But the question was, how do we know that the Quran is consistent with prior revelation, given the fact that the Quran says you can validate this with the books given to the Jews and the Christians, you see? So this is, like you said, it's an irresolvable dilemma, and that's why I had to sort of draw this out for him on the small board. What is your epistemic principle? Similarity to the Old Testament. And then eventually ended up saying, well, you just look and see with your eyes what's consistent with what's not consistent. You see, so you just look with your eyes. So can I not appeal to the same thing of just looking with my eyes?
It's also extremely funny because the Quran clearly and explicitly says about the Jews and Christians. It says, why do they come to you when they have what was revealed to them? Basically saying that they should just go back and read their books, but that doesn't make any sense if you once again present this whole problem. It again goes into this circular nonsense that he cannot get out of. What are they supposed to do? Jews and Christians are supposed to go and read their own scriptures. They're not supposed to come to Muhammad. Okay, if they are supposed to read their own scriptures, then they will be educated by their own scriptures on their own beliefs and on how their beliefs are, on what they are supposed to believe according to their own scriptures, which, if they do that, will eventually contradict with what Islam tells them. But then Daniel Kikachu and other Muslims come out and say, well, no. You can't take those things in there that contradict with real belief because, those are invalid. You should take the rest. Okay, what is the rest? Well, whatever agrees with my beliefs.
Yeah. Amazing that he couldn't see that was a circle. Now, if he affirms circular logic, then that would have been more honest, and he could have maybe gone in another direction. But of course, he didn't want to do that because typically when Muslims do accept varying degrees of philosophy, whichever school they're in, it's usually kind of a very broad stroke. For example, I have Azra Rashid's book. When we did our debate, I got his book, and his approach to epistemology was just a very basic empiricism. So, if you want to have that school and that approach, that's fine. But anybody that does that's going to have to deal with the outworkings of adopting that position. So if you have a very basic empiricist view, you're going to have a hard time justifying or giving account for questions like, what about a circular argument that you're presenting about the relationship of the Quran to prior revelation? You can't affirm, just from a strictly philosophical perspective, you're not going to be able to affirm circular argumentation if you're an empiricist, unless you just want to say that my position is just self-evident. But if he wants to go that route, then I can just say, okay, well, my position is self-evident. If everybody can just appeal to their own internal self-evidence, which I don't believe we should do in a debate, but if you do that, it kind of makes debate no longer possible because the opponent, you see, can appeal to the same thing. I can just appeal to all of my principles are just, quote, self-evident, right? So that's not usually the best. That's not usually how debates go, unless you're debating something like, some obscure topic like transcendental arguments or circular argumentation itself. Is it possible? Is it not possible? Most debates are not going in that way, and that's why Surah 3 says, "There is no God but He, the living, the self-subsisting. He sent down the book that is truth upon thee, confirming what it was before. He sent the Torah and the Injil, the gospel, and it is the guidance to mankind. Nothing about, but it is half corrupted, you see. Oh, it is 70% corrupted. And that's the thing, is that when you actually look at, and I haven't, let's just take the first 10 surahs, for example. I went through the first 10 and I got a giant list of all of the references in the first 10 to sections of the Torah and the prophets, right? And here's the thing, and this is what I was trying to get it. I don't think Daniel got this point, but I was trying to get it across, which is that you got giant portions that are referred to, referenced, giant stories, the Exodus story, the conquest of David, different stories in the book of Genesis, for example. The creation narrative is largely affirmed. So if we're going to admit that these giant portions of the Torah are correct, then we've got a problem of giant portions not correct, right? So it doesn't really matter what percentage you want to say. Let's say you think 70% of it's true and 30% is false. Or maybe you think 30% of the Old Testament, the prophets, is true and 70% is false. Either way, you're stuck in the same kind of bind because, number one, the Quran actually says, as you noted, that it's not consistent, right? Excuse me, that the Old Testament is not full of errors. That's a later argument that they make.
That is,
and when it does mention, I
Sorry.
think, like you said, when it does mention that that they perverted the message, it says they perverted the message with their mouth. It doesn't say the text is perverted. So there's not an intertextual argument that I'm aware of that argues that the Torah and the gospel are full of errors. This is a later argument. This is why they go to talk about going to non-believers. Well, they ran to, Bart Ehrman and people for so long until Bart Ehrman said that, no, there is historical evidence for Christ and crucifixion. And then I think they wanted to get rid of using Bart Ehrman because, again, so it's like this double standard is what I'm trying to say. There's a double standard of, I can't talk to you because you don't have the same religion as me. And it's like, but it doesn't have anything to do with the arguments. But the arguments are true or false, regardless of the person. But to go back to your point, like, I'm just trying to stress that, look, if you're going to say that a giant portion of the prior revelation is false, which is what his position amounts to, then you're going to have to give an account for why does the Quran then assume many of these stories, oftentimes in passing. So it'll just reference an event or a person, right? And how else would we know the context and the meaning, the background of that person without going to the prior revelation, which predates them? It predates the Quran and Islam.
And we have some very, very explicit Quran verses like chapter 5, verse 47, which say, and let the people of the gospel, Christians, judge by what Allah has revealed therein. And whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, then those are the defiantly disobedient. So according to that verse itself, what are Christians supposed to judge by? By the gospel, by what was revealed to them, in the Quran's understanding and Islam's understanding. The gospel is basically a revelation that was revealed to Jesus, like the Quran was revealed to Muhammad. It has a it has a big misunderstanding of what the gospel actually is, and it tells the Christians explicitly there that they should simply stand by and judge by what the gospel says. And there is no single reference throughout the Quran which explicitly tells you that those books are no longer valid, that those books have been corrupted, that they have been corrupted into oblivion. Such a mindset only emerged over the centuries, much later. I think as late as like the 11th century or 12th century, it became entrenched into Islamic thinking that those books, the Torah and the Injil, as they refer to them, meaning the gospel and the Torah, were overall corrupted. But that is just as it seems, an explanation that they came up with because they could not explain the abundance of contradictions between the Bible and the Quran, and contradictions on such a level that you cannot possibly believe that both of those sources, as they are today, came from the same God. You cannot hold on to both of them at the same time. It is simply impossible. And I would say it's like this whole game of those books are corrupt. They're not in their original form. They are only consistent wherever they are consistent with my beliefs. That would be like if you went out there, like if Christians went out there, or if anybody went out there and said, Muhammad was actually a righteous guy. He was led and he was leading people to the belief in one God. But his followers corrupted his sayings and corrupted the actual Quran, which was full of truth. And when Muslims then ask, well, how can you prove this? You simply say, well, everything that Muhammad said, everything in the Quran that agrees with our Abrahamic beliefs is correct, and everything else that disagrees is obviously corrupted. And there is your proof. Now let go of your Islamic beliefs and come to the truth. Put them in the same position.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, 2 points there that come to mind. I want to read that Surah 5. I'm glad you mentioned it because it's really strong. It says, "How is it that they come to thee for judgment when they have the Torah, wherein is God's judgment? Even after that, they turn their backs and they are not believers. Truly, we sent down the Torah. Wherein is guidance and light, by what the prophets who submitted unto God judge those who are Jews, as did the sages and the rabbis in accordance with God's books, as they were bidden to preserve it, and to which they were witnesses. So fear not, mankind, fear me. My signs sell not my signs for a paltry price. Where whosoever judges not by what God has sent down." So, like as you said, and it goes on to say, "In the footsteps we sent Jesus, confirming the Torah." And we gave him that gospel confirming the Torah. So the assumption of these texts is that there's continuity, not just with the Old Testament and the Quran, but between the Torah and what Jesus said. Right. Yeah. But when we go to what Jesus said, of course, there's a lot of problem texts, such as the entire Gospel of John, which is why usually Islamic apologetics just says that's one we throw out. So now we're throwing out entire books because, as you pointed out, well, wait a minute, the Quran speaks as if they thought the gospel or the Injil was this book that Jesus got, like Muhammad got the Quran. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's the disciples recording this oral message. Yeah. And then passing on various texts, which give, in my view, a coherent narrative. So it's just amazing that it's not a very complex argument. I mean, it might be complex if you're not used to the Old Testament or if you don't know actually what's in the Torah and the prophets and the Bible. But if you actually go and look and see, it's pretty clear. Now, the other thing that Daniel referenced was the text in Jeremiah, and he didn't even get that this was actually called out by one of the super chat questions, I think, if I recall. But he said, oh, well, you see, Jeremiah says that the scribes have perverted the text. It doesn't say the scribes perverted the Torah. It says that the scribes perverted their text, meaning their, what I would say when Jesus rebukes the Pharisees, he says, you've added things to the commands of God. And it doesn't mean that the Torah was essentially altered, because Jesus says in the same gospel that the scriptures cannot be broken. He presupposes and cites the Torah at length throughout the gospels. So the text in Jeremiah is not, first of all, referring to the Torah itself being corrupted. It's talking about the rabbinical traditions. However, even if Daniel did want to say that the text in Jeremiah is referring to the Torah being corrupted, Daniel doesn't have a principle by which to know for sure that that text of Jeremiah isn't corrupted. Yeah. Because the entire Old Testament and prophets, in his view, are potentially corrupted. That's why I asked him the principle of epistemic certitude. Like, what is the principle by which you judge when the Old Testament is true, when it's false? Well, it's whenever it agrees with the Quran. Okay, well, how do you know that the text in Jeremiah that you're citing about corruption isn't also corrupted? Because it agrees with the Quran. So, again, it all comes back to this circle. But as you pointed out, it's not even a good circle, because the book itself that is his ultimate principle already affirms that there's not error and contradiction in the prior revelations.
Yeah. Even if we talk about, so when we talk about Jeremiah as a source, there is another problem which we talked about last week when we were in your channel, which is that Jeremiah as a prophet, as a prophetic source, is not even recognized in Islam. So you could. It's not mentioned in the Quran. This might be a big surprise to many people, but Jeremiah is not mentioned in the Quran. Huge prophet in Abrahamic religion. Samuel is not mentioned in the Quran. Huge prophet. Isaiah is amazingly huge prophet, not mentioned in the Quran. Islam has no clue about Isaiah. Daniel, which is very ironic, is also Daniel Kikichu's name, is not mentioned in the Quran. These prophets are not recognized as prophets anywhere in the Quran. Any Muslim knowledge about these prophets comes from Jews and Christians. They have to go to Jews and Christians literally to get information about these people. So when it comes to Daniel Haqiqatjou referencing something in Jeremiah, that would mean he is making reference to a book that is a prophetic book according to the Jews and Christians, whom he cannot trust because they allegedly corrupted everything. So he is appealing to a potentially corrupted source, which, according to him, argues that things were at some point corrupted. There's just no way to go for to make a solid argument against, for the corruption of Judaism and Christianity.
Well, the other funny thing too is that, and by the way, I know that in our last talk on my channel, we had talked about the fact that many of these prophets that are major figures in the Old Testament, major prophets, that I didn't even realize that they're not even mentioned by name in the sense of absolutely no mention. I thought maybe there's passing references, to the holy prophet of so-and-so, but you're saying Jeremiah is not even mentioned at all.
It's not mentioned at all. Wow. Jeremiah has no mention in the Quran. That's
wild because, if we were looking for a religion that was in continuity with prior prophets, I mean, from the vantage point of Jews and Christians, I mean, Isaiah, as we said, is called the fifth gospel. I mean, it's just huge. Even if you don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, Isaiah is gigantic. It's 66 chapters. I mean, it's huge. Ezekiel, huge, right? Jeremiah, huge. I mean, vast books of the Old Testament. And by the way, just a little funny side note, the name Daniel means God is my judge. And the El there would be probably what Daniel was looking for when he was looking for the name that was pagan, Elohim. That doesn't mean the name is pagan, right? This is a word concept fallacy because it's just like the word divinity. The word divinity or deity might refer to God. It might refer to many gods. It might refer to angels, demons, or a human being viewed as a divine figure. It's a generic term. And so amongst the Canaanites, the term El could be a reference to any kind of deity or a class of deities, right? So a lot of people make this mistake because they think, oh, well, anything with the name El in it, Daniel, must be. So ironically, his own name would be a pagan name.
I mean, the Bible also uses El or Eloh as when it refers to other gods, when it refers to other false gods, when it refers to them making a god of objects of different things.
That's what I'm saying. It's a word that's a generic term, like the word deity or divinity.
Yeah. So it would be it's just very ignorant from Daniel's perspective and other people's perspective to argue that would be the actual name, and then to deny the existence of Yahweh as name of God. And this is one of my favorite things by now to go to. One of my favorite arguments against Islam, the whole absence and ignorance of the name Yahweh in Islam. And we talked about this in length on your. I don't know if we talk about it.
Yeah, it's an amazing argument that you found there with that, and especially going into the prophets whose names are also derivatives of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I can't see how this argument could be overcome. I mean, it's really probably one of the strongest that I've heard. So again, the fact that you, being atheist, have that argument has nothing to do. I mean, the argument stands on its own, right? So it's like, it's a strong argument no matter who says it. And I think that any position that doesn't want to deal with arguments and has to kind of fall over into these kinds of like, oh, well, he needs to just be gotten rid of, or shut him up. I mean, that's just showing kind of a weakness in the position from my vantage point.
Yeah, and even when I brought that whole argument about the name Yahweh, on how Islam is completely ignorant of the name Yahweh, I specifically brought that topic to him and challenged him on that, because I knew very well that his understanding of scripture theology and things like that is very, very poor. He was actively, I mean, it clearly looks like he was actively researching while I was talking, and then trying to give me these halfway answers to my challenge. And what he did come up with is, well, Yahweh was not in Genesis, which is false. Yahweh is just it's a name that the Hebrews probably adopted, this pagan name from these polytheistic people, and then gave that name to their own god. And later prophets actually fought against this and wanted to rid their religion of this corruption, but then it just kept being used in this corrupt form. It just doesn't
So weird,
make
because
sense.
that's usually when people who, and that's a very low tier argument, like you said, based on ignorance. They usually are referring to Elohim. Usually they say the name Elohim is the one that is borrowed from Canaanite religion, and therefore Christianity and Judaism are false, because there's this paganization just on the basis of a word concept fallacy of the name Elohim. But I think he got mixed up, or he just slipped. Oh, well, Yahweh is the same thing. It's like that. It's a pagan. But it's not. There's no equivalent that I'm aware of it being a pagan name.
So what he did as a result is he completely wasted the one opportunity of actually dealing with that argument, and still presents it as if he was actually he actually successfully argued his point when he was challenged with that. But when you look at the footage, you can clearly see that he gives completely nonsensical answers, and it's just out there, and he still doesn't engage with it anymore. Because after I called him out that his response doesn't make sense, that his response that Yahweh is a pagan name basically invalidates Islam as well, because Islam itself, the Quran itself, uses theophoric names which clearly reference Yahweh, including the biggest I would say is Elijah. Which literally means Eli Yahweh, my God is Yahweh. And he didn't even get that. He was like, okay, well, why is that Yahweh? That doesn't sound like Yahweh. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't have to exactly sound like Yahweh.
It's a derivative.
Yeah, it's Eli Yahu. Eli Yah. The Yah is already enough. That is what is commonly used throughout the Bible and throughout Hebrew to reference Yahweh. And that should already be enough for him. Plus, we have two instances of the Quran explicitly saying that John and Jesus, two figures that where Allah announced their names beforehand, before they were born. It is Allah Himself who gave them those names, and both of those names reference Yahweh.
Yeah, Yahshua. Right?
Yeah. So it is just.
Well, I don't know if you saw when I posted you the clip that you argued.
Mm-hmm.
His reply was, "I never said that," and it's like the clip has you saying, "What do you mean never said it?"
And that's it. He won't respond to that, right?
I mean that was the response. I never said that.
Yeah. Freebird said Yahweh not mentioned in New Testament.
Sure it is.
Yeah, go ahead if you want to respond to that. So I would say off the top of my head, it is already. First off, it's a completely irrelevant point, because Christians don't have the problem which Muslims have of not having the previous scriptures, the Old Testament. It is known as the Old Testament, and it's part of the Bible. So Christians read the very book which mentions Yahweh over 6,000 times, although due to Hebrew tradition, it is changed into Adonai in Hebrew, and in English, for example, into Lord in capital letters. But that is basically Yahweh. Plus the New Testament says Hallelujah, for example, which is a direct inclusion, a direct reference to Yahweh.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can demonstrate this. One of those, as I pointed out, is if you look at Exodus 3, when you have the burning bush manifestation, or what we call a theophany. It's known as the Ayer Asha Ayer. It's God saying, I am that I am. And so God is the I am. This is also equivalent to, or a reference to Yahweh as well, because if you go over to Exodus 23, God says that the angel who will go before the messenger. Now remember, a messenger doesn't always mean a created angel. It can be a divine messenger, or it can be a created messenger like Gabriel or whoever. But if you look at Exodus 23, the same messenger, or the voice that speaks in the bush, is identified as the same messenger who will, I'll read it. Behold, I will send my messenger before your face to keep you in the way and in the land that I prepared. Listen to him and obey the voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your sins. Only God can pardon sins, by the way, not angels. My name, Yahweh, is in him, is in the being speaking from the bush. It's this identified as the same being of Exodus 3. And so when you read the Gospel of John, Jesus says, in many instances, I am. He says, I am. When before Abraham was, I am. And particularly if you want to focus on John 1 and then John 5 through 9, in those chapters, Jesus identifies himself as the one that spoke to Moses. So the one speaking in the bush, the one speaking and being the messenger to go before them to either pardon them or not pardon them in Exodus 23, Jesus identifying himself as that to the Pharisees. And that's what motivates the Pharisees in John 5 through 9 to want to stone him, because they recognize Jesus saying, Abraham believed in me. Abraham saw my day. Abraham believed in me, saw my day and was glad. He says, Moses, right? No one sees the Father at any time, but he says that somebody was there speaking to Moses. He's implying that it was himself. He says, Moses wrote about me. This isn't what enrages the Pharisees, because Jesus is identifying himself as the angel of the Lord and as the face that spoke to Moses. And this makes them want to stone him. So those passages, I think, are very clear if you're familiar with the typology. And also, if you go through a lot of these passages that I mentioned that are called theophanies, these are manifestations of distinctions in the Old Testament that refer both to the Father, to the angel of Yahweh or the angel of the Lord, and to the Spirit. And this is just a partial list. There's many, many more. It got smudged over here. But if you go back to the Daniel debate, you can see all of those that I've referenced. And so what you get is a comprehensive, in my view, presentation of differentiation in Yahweh throughout the Old Testament that the New Testament is consistent with. Even if you didn't believe in Christianity, I think that modern Jews, for example, that I mentioned in the debate, the Summer text, the Siegel text, the Schaeffer, they're all Jewish scholars. They're admitting that there is quite a bit of differentiation and distinction in the persona of Yahweh in the Old Testament. So it's not a strict Unitarianism. Mm-hmm. So I'm just pointing out that whether you're a Christian who approaches the New Testament and the name of Yahweh and how it's differentiated in the Old and New Testament, how it's applied to Christ, or whether you're a Jew who's looking at, for example, Daniel 7 in the text where we see this one like a son of man, these Jewish scholars are admitting that early Christianity is consistent with a, quote, conservative Judaism of that time.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not a completely wholesale made up religion. In fact, they're admitting that without believing it, they're admitting that the Jews, the early Christians who were all Jews, were attempting to interpret and be consistent with the revelation in the Torah and the prophets that was not a strict Unitarianism. And in fact, I think Summers argues that the really strict Unitarianism of Judaism doesn't really come about until Maimonides. So that's also interestingly kind of parallel with the rise of Islam in its strict version of Unitarianism.
Mm-hmm. What is very interesting is dealing with all of these issues that are presented when we deal with Islam and compare it to Abrahamic religion. You pointed out that there seems to be this this attitude, this behavior among traditionalist Muslims, which Daniel Kikichu seems to be a representative of not really engaging with the argument. And there is an older tradition of simply not asking questions, and that goes back to such a fundamental level. Indeed, I quickly want to point that out. That is not just something we say. There is a term in Arabic, bila kayf, which literally means without how, or which means without asking how. Without asking how, and that is a concept, a principle, which became popularized by very early Muslim scholars, and which traditionalist Muslims, literalists, legalists stood by for quite a long time when they dealt with, for example, how Allah is described in the Quran, and that there are references to Allah having body parts, but then also references to Allah being just everywhere at all time, and this and that, and Muslims had problems figuring out how exactly they're supposed to make sense of these different interpretations. And the early scholars came up with this explanation, or with this coping method, which was, do not ask how, just read it, accept it, do not ask questions. And this is an actual concept. As said, it's called bila kayf, and quite a few Muslim schools have stood by it. Traditionalist schools today are still very much respecting that rule. Some of them.
Does this go back to like the Hanbal?
Yeah, it's. I think a prominent opinion is that Ahmad ibn Hanbal actually came up with that whole explanation.
Oh, wow.
It was his idea that this is what needs to be done in order to preserve proper belief and to avoid corrupting theology. So just take whatever the text says. Do not question it. Do not try to make sense of it. Do not compare the apparent contradictions. It's none of your business. Just accept it. That's it. And that's also consistent with the Quran saying, for the true believers, when they hear Allah's verses, they say, "I hear and I obey." That's it. And another instruction by Muhammad, where he says that the devil comes to you and asks you questions about Allah and who created this and who created that. Whenever that happens, seek refuge with Allah and cease thinking about these things. So these are actual Islamic instructions.
Does that in that view, does that also apply to the Hadith or just the Quran?
Hadiths are more complicated, much more complicated, but I guess with the Hadiths, what they do is they respect the tradition of figuring out what is and is not authentic in the Hadiths, and then accepting whichever Hadith is most supported, most stable. If there are differing reports on a specific instance, but yeah, so there is, for example, a Hadith which says. Which I love, which says that Allah comes down every night at a specific time
to the low worlds.
Yeah, to the lowest heaven, the heaven of the earth, and stays there to listen to all the prayers, and then he goes back again. And when you actually think about that very deeply, that doesn't make any sense, because when exactly, how exactly would that work, considering that it is always night somewhere? And there are just
well, and also, I mean, this is kind of that point about the shins and the above the throne. These are spatial locations, and if we're supposed to believe in Tawheed, that's not possible, and so we're sort of forced into a position then of making analogies, saying, oh, this just represents various attributes and powers, right? But then when we do that, we're now moving into the domain of philosophical explanations and analogical predication. And if we're going to do analogical predication, then we have to square that with the text that says that there's absolutely nothing in creation that's like Allah. So you can't have both of those things, right? You can't have analogical predication. And for those that don't know, predication by analogy means predication on the basis of likeness and similarity, right? So God is a judge in the way that a virtuous human being is a righteous judge, right? So he judges between cases. God judges, right? A father loves his son. God loves us in an analogous way. It's an analogy between the love of a father and a son and God's love for us. This is just throughout history of theology, but in the Middle Ages, analogical predication is just predicating on the basis of similarity and likeness. But you see, the Quran's already said there's no likeness at all between Allah and anything created. But then we have all these names, which are predicates, right? Allah the merciful, Allah the righteous judge. And then we have these attribute or these qualities that are predicated like shin, like spatial location. So they have to be explained then at the same time as saying, but there is no such thing as analogical predication. Oh, but there is analogical predication. And then they just sort of talk around what that means, right?
Yeah.
And I brought this up to pretty much every Muslim I've debated except for Daniel. I didn't bring it up to Daniel, but all the other ones I brought it up, and it's just like, well, it's not saying that Allah is like creatures. It's saying that Allah is like this or that power. And it's like, okay, well, is the power that you're talking about concept in your head? Okay, well, that's a creature, right? The concept that they have in your head of Allah's hand and Allah's, movement, or what, those are created things in your view. And you're saying that they are descriptors, or Azar Rashid said, they signify the divine. Well, to signify the divine is to say that this is a created symbol. That's symbology. That's analogical predication. So how, if Allah is not like any creature, is there analogical predication? You see, this is Surah, it's 42:11. It's not long. I'll read it. It says, the originator of the heavens and earth, he has appointed for you mates among yourselves and has appointed mates amongst the cattle. He multiplies you thereby, and naught is like unto him. Yet he is the hearer and the seer. So those are analogies. To hear and to see are analogous to human activities, right? So we're saying that Allah hears and Allah sees, but not as a man sees and not as a man hears. But not only that, here's the problem. Unto him belongs the keys of heaven and earth. He comprehends and straightens provision for whomever he will. He has prescribed that there is, let me go back a little bit. It was verse 11. He multiplies you thereby, but there is nothing like unto him. Yeah, that was the text I was looking for. Excuse me. I didn't mean to keep reading. But, and then you notice in the notes, if you have the study Quran, they talk about this discussion of nothing being like unto him. And I think there's another one too, which talks in this way. I forget which one it is, but the point being is that if there's nothing like unto him, this is, I think, called Tanzih, Tanzih, the doctrine of absolute dissimilarity between Allah and creatures. If there's absolute dissimilarity, then we can't be using these predicates like hearing, seeing, movement.
Yeah. The issue is, if you already begin to analyze the things that the Quran says and point out the obvious problem here, you slowly approach a topic that has been plaguing the Muslim world in terms of theology for forever, from the very, very beginning, and that is still around, and over which branches of Muslims, schools of Islam, have been denouncing each other and calling each other disbelievers, and even sentencing each other to death and persecuting each other.
And you're saying specifically over this question of like the hand and the placement over the throne?
This is one of the questions. So one of the questions that caused such a huge mess, and still does, is that the body parts,
Yep.
the attributes, the specific descriptions of Allah, and how you can reconcile them with the fact that there is nothing like Allah, and how far you can think about them. And this is actually a very funny thing. I grew up in a very religious household, and stuff like this was hammered into my head all the time from all sides, and I always had trouble understanding that that there is nothing like Allah, and I cannot even imagine it. I'm not supposed to. I cannot think about it. I cannot imagine it. But then I'm also given these conflicting descriptions of what Allah does at what time and how He will appear. And I'm like, okay, but I just, it doesn't make sense. I can't reconcile that. And I might have had this issue as simply somebody who witnesses these descriptions of Allah and who doesn't study further, but this has been an issue from the very beginnings of Islamic history, and there have been the traditionalists who, as said, stuck to the whole idea that you should not question, because if you question, then you will cause problems. And there have been the others who are basically the evidence of specifically that. The mainstream Muslims were of the idea that Allah is up there, and we have certain things that are described about Him, but we are not supposed to really think about that. Those things may be metaphorical or literal. We do not know. We don't think about that. And then there are those the mysticists who go further and to say Allah is probably up there, wherever that is, but that's it. We're not going to go into anything else. Everything about Him can only be metaphorical, and we leave it at that. And then there are others who go to the extreme, and actually, my parents were kind of part of that, and they were like in such an extreme form of mysticism where they deal with all of this mess simply by saying Allah is not in any direction. It is wrong to say Allah is up there, although that was the Islamic tradition always. He's everywhere, all at once, very close to you, within you, even to certain in a certain understanding. And there is no way that you can possibly imagine or even describe Him. The only way He can be described is in the Quran, and we only understand that entirely metaphorically. So it's just a huge mess, and all of these perspectives are not just perspectives that sit at a table and think, okay, you make sense. Yeah, you make sense. Okay, I disagree with you. No, they actually fought each other and killed each other over these over these problems, over these disagreements. And that is just one of those issues. It's the location of Allah, the body parts, and what Allah is like. It's whether the Quran is an eternal part of Allah or not, whether it came into existence through His speech exactly as it is or not. All of these things were issues of major contention that Muslims truly sentenced each other to death and still kind of
Well, this is odd because, you know, in Christianity, for example, in the 4th century, there's a really intense debate that's kind of analogous to the debate that occurs in the Middle Ages between Jews and Christians and Muslims over naming God. And this is the 4th century controversy that the Cappadocians, this is Basil and the 2 Gregories, were very important to Orthodox theology. They had a debate with a guy named Eunomius, and a big part of that debate was over how and in what ways we can name and predicate of God. And the only reason I bring that up is because it's interesting that, in other words, if Islam is the correct next revelation, so to speak, after Judaism or whatever they think Judaism and Christianity are, then it's almost like there's no cognizance of a prior intense, nuanced discussion of this very question of predicating of God. So it's like if you were the new revelation, it seems like you would at least have an understanding of the previous Jewish Christian discussions and debates over naming God, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, in other words, Basil and the Cappadocians have this debate with Eunomius, who's the earlier he's like a Unitarian in the sense of Islam or Judaism in the Middle Ages. And the debate is over whether the names that we say of God are univocal, equivocal, or analogous. A univocal term is one in which there's an exact same meaning between the two reference, right? So, for example, if we said God's love is identical to the sense in which man's love, father-son love, that would be univocal predication. And Eunomius, who was the radical Unitarian in the days of Basil and the Gregories, he believed in univocal predication. Equivocal predication would be what Islam has, which is that there's no similarity between When I say God has justice towards us, there's no similarity between that justice and, human law courts and their created justice. Analogical predication, which is, again, what the Cappadocians and Christian theology wholesale adopts. I would argue from the earliest days. I think you could find it in the Old and New Testament itself. It continues clearly into this controversy in the councils, which Daniel, for whatever reason, wasn't familiar with what councils are and what they're about or what they mean. He thinks that they're just new revelations, kind of like new voices of the Holy Spirit or something like that. That's not what councils are. But the point is just that this is already a really well-known, intense debate for centuries in Christianity. When Islam arises, the points that you're making about the rise of not questioning or naming or explaining the hands of God or Allah, or the Allah sees, and here's, don't ask what that is. It's just ironic because this debate's already happened. If you're the continuation of the prior revelation, why is there no cognizance of that whole discussion? And not only that, it's like, maybe I'm not wording this well. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty clear.
It's similar to the point we were making about the Quran seems to not even understand what Christianity, whether you think it's true or not, it doesn't understand what the Trinity was, right? There's like a Trinity in the Quran, which includes Mary, right? It's like they thought that the Trinity included Mary. It doesn't, never did. But likewise, it's like there was no conception of what the previous discussions of predicating of God were. And so it's almost like bypassing that and saying, well, Allah is nothing like creation. And that's how it's, so it's all, equivocal predication. But it's like, but throughout your book, there's analogical predication. So how could it be equivocal predication?
Yeah. The reference to the Trinity and the Quran not understanding what it is actually a very fascinating one that I made a video on very early on when I started making these critical videos. The Quran has different understandings. There are different interpretations of what Christians actually believe in, but in one of those instances, Jay is not making this up. The Quran actually does say so. It describes a supposed fantasy conversation in the future after everything dies and is resurrected between Allah and Jesus, where Allah asks Jesus, "Did you say to the people, 'Take me and my mother as deities beside Allah'?" And Jesus will say, "No, I did not. I would never say that." So it looks like the Quran is there arguing against this clearly great belief among Christians that Allah consists of three, which is Allah, Jesus, and Mother Mary. And it's very surprising that when you find that out, that the Quran seems to not understand what Christians actually believe in, and then deals with a completely irrelevant belief that no Christian actually represents. And if you bring this problem up today, they will try to explain that away by saying, well, okay, there were probably some Christian sects in that time who did have such a belief, and this is specifically addressing them, or they will say this is a reference to Christians venerating her way too much and turning her into a god, but that's clearly not the case there.
Well, first of all, we would need to know what's the evidence that there was a historic group that did deify and put Mary as a member of the Trinity. I mean, I suppose that's possible, but I've never heard of this. But secondly, even if that was the case, why would you be addressing some tiny fringe group that had no continuity and is basically irrelevant, right? I mean, wouldn't you want to address the actual positions? That's what I'm trying to say, right? Yeah. And it's the same point with analogical predication. Like, wouldn't you want to at least address or explain, the Christians, when they had their debates with the Eunomians and you know what I mean, and they made their great mistake on analogical predication, as Basil and the Gregories did, who are the great prophets of the early, like, there's no knowledge of any of this, is what I'm trying to say.
That's actually, that's a very big problem. It's, I have to be very honest. It is when I started getting out of Islam And during that whole process, I was trying to further understand Christianity and Judaism. So I started reading the Bible, and I noticed that it was completely foreign to me. And the same thing is, so this is a problem that Muslims in general deal with. To them, the Bible, Abrahamic belief, is entirely foreign because all they know about it is stuff that comes from the Quran
Yeah.
and from Muslim tradition. Other than that, and that stuff, what comes from the Quran, is incredibly limited and very ignorant
Yeah.
because there is no continuation. Because the Quran is simply its own product, which emerged in the 7th century. It makes references to the Bible, to Judaism and Christianity, and to their beliefs, but it is completely absent from the vast knowledge that comes with the Bible. So the Quran, Islam claims to be the final message, claims to continue what was before, but then completely disregards and gets rid of all of the knowledge that is in the Bible, which is abundant in comparison to the Quran, and then moves on with that. And then, as you said, has no understanding of all of the problems that are already addressed in Christianity and Judaism, has no understanding of so many things mentioned in the Bible, has no connection to Jewish and Christian history and theology that was already centuries old in terms of Christianity. That is a huge problem. And
Yeah, I would say it
go ahead.
to better formulate what I was trying to say, the way you put it more concisely there. If the Quran and Islam were the correct final or new revelation, I would expect there to be an addressing of the specifics of where the previous system or systems got these things wrong.
Yeah,
But
precisely.
what we see is actually no familiarity or consistent knowledge of very precise, very well known doctrines, theologians, and people.
I can think of one issue, which is Christology and
Yeah.
Jesus. Early Christian history has a very prominent history of discussing it, coming to a proper understanding of the nature of Jesus, the crucifixion and the resurrection. I mean, that's a core issue, right? It is the core. It is the fundamentals of Christianity is Jesus comes, preaches, does many things, and then, very important, he is crucified and then he is resurrected, and that resurrection is supposed to play a great role in terms of what Christians believe in. Islam is supposed to come and correct the Christians because they were wrong about Jesus, about how they explained his crucifixion and resurrection. But it doesn't do anything about it at all. It doesn't even address the resurrection. It just, all it says about the death of Jesus is, and they did not crucify him, nor did they kill him, but it was made to appear that way to them, and that's it. Why wouldn't the Quran address this whole giant elephant in the room if the Christians are indeed wrong, if they corrupted their own beliefs, if Christianity is a giant misunderstanding, as the Quran claims? Why would it not deal with Christology? Why would it not deal with what exactly happened after Jesus died, with the resurrection? It doesn't do any of these things, and therefore leaves a huge discussion completely unanswered. It's just as Daniel Kikechu says, well, just look at it, and whatever agrees with Islam is true, and whatever doesn't is false. That's it.
Well, and I mean, it was like all of what you just said is bypassed by you just look and see with your eyes. Okay, well, can I not? I could appeal to the same thing. Well, when I look and see with my eyes, it confirms my view, right? So, I mean, that was really just a non-answer. But yeah, I mean, this is a great point about the resurrection. I mean, even if you didn't believe in Christianity, you would at least want to understand, well, what is their view? Why do they think that this is so important? What does the resurrection have to do with the fall of man? What about all these prophecies, for example, in the Psalms of David that we see as predictions and prophecies of the Messiah, his descent to Hades, and his resurrection? Now, maybe you don't believe that, but it would be better. It would make sense to understand, like, here is what they believe, and this is why it is false. But we don't get that. That's what's amazing, is that there's not even an understanding of what the position is. And I feel like if this was a divine revelation, they would at least, God would understand what the errors were, you see, and they would be corrected. But it doesn't even explain what the erroneous position is. In fact, it misunderstands the erroneous position.
Yeah, there's actually a very interesting Quran verse that I quickly want to go to, and I might put it on the screen here because I wanted to bring that up. It's actually very relevant to the very point. Let me share this on here. So, Quran chapter 3, verse 55. I'm appealing to all the different translations here, but I'll just take the first one, Sahih International. What it says, mention when Allah said, "O Jesus, indeed I will take you and raise you to myself and purify you from those who disbelieve and make those who follow you superior to those who disbelieve until the day of resurrection. Then to me is your return, and I will judge between you concerning that in which you used to differ." It's very, very interesting point. Very interesting verse here. So Allah told Jesus that he will raise him and purify him from those who denied him, while making those who followed him and believed him superior until the day of judgment. Interesting, but how exactly does that work? So who were those people who followed Jesus? Who were the people who acknowledged him, who believed him? And which group exactly has been made superior since then? And which group will be made superior from then till the day of judgment?
Yeah, I'm actually baffled by this. What is their explanation of this? I don't understand.
The explanation that I can tell you will be, well, this is actually a reference to the Muslims. It doesn't make much sense.
But what do they think the raising is?
Well, that he was just, he was raised to heaven as a prophet, and he will stay there and he will come back one day. And when he comes back, he will then announce that all the Christians and all the people who had these corrupt beliefs went astray, and that the Muslims are actually the true believers. And then he will come and fight for the Muslims and abolish the cross and break the cross and do things like that, and basically become a Muslim Jesus. That is their explanation. But if you read it on the surface, it just looks like it pretty much approves of the Christians.
It reminds me of I forget exactly where it is, but Sam Shamoon had referenced there's actually just sections of the Gospel of John that are kind of cribbed. You know what I'm talking about?
Uh-huh.
Like there's like several verses that are basically just copied and pasted into the Quran.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Which is interesting because they typically want to say the Gospel of John is fraudulent. It's like, wait a minute, aren't some of the passages actually just copied and pasted into the Quran? Well, those are the ones that are not corrupted. Oh, okay, I see.
You can also find Muslims occasionally give some references from the Gospel of John in order to prove that Muhammad was mentioned in the Gospels, or that Jesus prayed like a Muslim, or things like that, which is a very selective, dishonest approach. They will take the part, for example, where Jesus throws himself on the ground and prays, and they will say, "Look, he prayed exactly like Muslims pray." But that's not. He didn't do a ritual prayer there. That's not the only prayer he ever did, according to the Gospel. So that's a very, very interesting.
Well, it's like that text in Deuteronomy that they use about "I'll raise a prophet amongst your brethren," and Christianity obviously has always seen that as a prophecy of the Messiah. You find many church fathers prior to the rise of Islam citing that as a text about the Messiah. Conceivably, Jews might also cite it as a potential messianic text, but for Muslims, that's a prediction of Muhammad. And I didn't really get to go into this, but when it was mentioned in the debate, the argument was, well, this is about Muhammad. And I said, well, but it says amongst your brethren. So I'm pretty sure Muhammad wasn't a Jew. And they said, oh, but they can all be brethren because everybody's a brethren all the way back to Abraham. And I'm like, well, but wait a minute. Genesis says cast out the slave woman. And so they're not actually brethren. But in the Jewish sense, they're not brethren. And that's the sense that we would be getting from Deuteronomy 18, not the Quranic sense. It would be the Jewish sense of brethren.
What's funny is
one last point. The other thing that's funny about that, which is that, so wait a minute, if everybody is a brethren, then Edomites are brethren, but no Jew would call an Edomite a brethren. They're the enemies of the Jews, but they have just as much a lineage that's common as what would be Hagarites.
It might be amazing to you the forms of responses that you can get from Muslims in order to cope with that problem, which is when they bring that up. I even got the response, which was a ridiculous one when I think about it again and again, which is that it says your brethren, and that clearly means that it's in reference to the Ishmaelites, to the others, because that's why it says brethren instead of just saying from you or your own tribe.
But no Jew is going to listen to an Ishmaelite. That's the weird part. It's like the rest of Deuteronomy assumes that only a Jew is only going to listen to a Jew.
Yeah, and that's the whole problem. But then there comes forth some guy in 7th century Arabia who doesn't like his own culture and his own religious beliefs, and looks up to the Christians and Jews and thinks he's gonna just start a message and claim that the same God is speaking to him. And what's very interesting is I actually put a thing together. I took out all of the references in the Quran to Christians and Jews and put them in chronological order as far as we know. And you can see very much that in the beginning it is just this very naive approach to the Christians and Jews of like, oh yeah, they're nice, they're good, they have true beliefs, and we are just like them, same source, same guys. And then it increasingly gets into disagreements with them, and eventually at some point it comes to, okay, they have their beliefs, you have your belief, and finally it comes to they will accept your beliefs or else. So it is just a very naive, ignorant approach from Muhammad to Jewish and Christian beliefs. And here we are dealing with a religious group that actually claims to be in possession of the true religion, yet one that is completely disconnected and completely ignorant. And I actually want to ask you a question about that. So when you read the Quran, when you began studying the Quran, as somebody who extensively studied the Bible, what was your impression of the Quran? Did it appear similar in I don't know, what was your impression in comparison to your own?
My initial impression is not really any different than where I'm at now. It's just kind of like I've read more text from scholars that I think really back up the impression that I had, which is, especially like the Gabriel Said Reynolds book, where he goes through about 13 or 15, I forget how many, case studies where he basically just compares the references in the Quran to the biblical context from which they come, and then contrasts and compares the narratives, whether they make sense, where they contradict, and then the various Islamic explanations. So it's a really good book from a person who, I don't think he's a Christian or a Muslim. He's just an academic, but the text shows the ways that there have been attempts to explain. And it also shows what was really helpful to me, all of the different extra canonical sources that Islam also draws from. So I think you made a great point when you and I were talking about this the other day. When you start getting into the hadiths is where it becomes a lot clearer that there's a lot of other influences here. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you're just dealing with the Quran. You're also dealing with about a bunch of oral tradition, which is kind of collected and then has to be scholarly kind of fetted out as to how authoritative they are. But those also apparently rely on a lot of myths and narratives and stories, as the Quran does. And so when I first started reading the Quran, my first impression was it sounds like the Bible, but it's like I was detecting kind of like stories and references that they didn't understand that are cobbled together. And then your point about the hadith, I think, further backs that up. But now I see, okay, well, it's not just the infancy narrative of Christ that you referenced as a extra canonical text. It's also Cave of Treasures, Life of Adam and Eve, Proto-Evangelium of James. It's all of the Sleepers of Ephesus. It's all these other stories and traditions, some of which are also, by the way, Talmudic, which is odd because, that weird reference that Reynolds points out about how the Sabbath was a punishment. But it's like that's absolutely totally foreign to everything that's in prior Revelation. It's not a punishment. It goes back to Genesis, right?
How about expand on it very quickly for those
go
who don't know? You can quickly expand on it if you want to, or I can do that.
No, I'll let you expand on it because it was just a cap on to summarize my point there about the more that I would get into this, the more I'm realizing, well, no, wait a minute, this is like cribbed from earlier stuff, cobbled together, and what's cobbled together is not actually coherent. But then it's the job of the Islamic scholars to try to make this thing work. That's what I get from it.
Yeah. So the point about the Sabbath in the Quran is people who have looked into that more deeply can pretty much, I guess, explain that better. But I made a note a while ago here on that. But the Quran basically, when it references the Sabbath, doesn't recognize it as something that is a fundamental or essential part of biblical or Jewish belief. What it basically says is that the Sabbath was just prescribed to the Jews as a punishment for their actions, for their transgressions, and it was basically a burden placed on them by Allah, which is why only they keep it. So that's a very ridiculously ignorant.
Yeah, I mean, it's very central to the entirety of the Torah. It goes back to Genesis as part of the creation narrative. So it's almost like to think that the Sabbath would be a punishment would be to, again, completely misunderstand something very fundamental to Genesis, which is the 7 days and the Sabbath. And in the Said Reynolds book, it's pages 109, 10, and 11, and you've got multiple Islamic scholars and people have tried to explain this, and it's just all the different explanations are they're amusing because when you see the scholarly explanations, they're not understanding what the meaning was for the Jews and the Christians. So I could understand so fine, you think it's wrong, but at least understand how central this was to the creation narrative and to the entirety of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
To think that, as many of these scholars have said, that it was a punishment from God, it just shows an incoherence of not even understanding the narrative. Just like with other things that we talked about, like the Ark of the Covenant, they thought that because it had the seraphim on top of it as a box, that it was a box that flew.
Yeah. So here is the reference we're talking about in the Quran in chapter 16, verse 124. It says basically, the Sabbath was only appointed for those who differed over it, and indeed your Lord will judge between them on the day of resurrection concerning that over which they used to differ. And it is further than recognized that the Jews were basically transgressors over and over again, and the Sabbath was only given to them because of their troubles and their transgressions.
Yeah, and it's even you have, this is 447. You have been given the book. Believe in what we have brought down, which confirms which is already with you before we transform the figures, turning them inside out. We curse you as we curse the people of the Sabbath.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know, it is just sometimes I feel like it is very hard to put into words the amount of ignorance that the Quran brings to the table when it talks about Abrahamic biblical beliefs and to then claim that this is the same God, the same source, it's just absurd.
Yeah, and again, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to approach this discussion, this debate. I mean, another example would be if you thought, for example, that the revelation to Jews and Christians was false. One thing that's prevalent throughout the Old and the New Testament is analogical predication. So if you're going to say that was all wrong and we can't do analogical predication, which conceivably you could have with many Islamic schools and the denial and the teaching of Tanzi, then you would need to, again, explain or at least understand that this group for thousands of years, for centuries prior to Islam with Christianity, for 6 centuries, that they got this big thing wrong. Mm-hmm. And again, there's not even a reference to, so let me put it this way. There's very sophisticated philosophical debates. Okay. Here's a great book that's just on this very topic I recommend. And this is from just an academic at, it's published by Oxford. I forget where he teaches, but it's a well-known book called The Rise of Christian Theology and the End of Ancient Metaphysics. And it basically traces the development of just the idea of hypostasis, right, which is very important to the Trinity, all the way from the Cappadocians to John Damascus in the 700s, 7th century, which is contemporary. He's the first Christian to write about Islam, by the way. So basically, we're going to trace this really sophisticated development of what hypostasis is in the Trinity and what it is in Christology. And it's very nuanced, very precise. There's a lot of philosophical terminology, a lot of references to Aristotle, all this kind of stuff. And then by the time that we get the revelations to Muhammad, it's like that none of this ever happened, you see. And again, I'm stressing this argument because if we're going to look at continuity, again, we would want to know precisely where the previous tradition was wrong. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to bank everything on philosophy, but it's sort of like, Christianity had already adopted and baptized and was okay with philosophy by this point. Even if you think it's wrong, this is not really debatable. It's pretty easy it's pretty well known, right? I mean, John Damascus, for example, he wrote an entire book on Aristotelian philosophy. He has another book on dialectical philosophy. I mean, his systematic theology in the 7th century is utilizing a lot of philosophy, as we said, from Cappadocians and people prior to him. Maximus the Confessor, full of a lot of philosophy in his text. And it's like, if you're going to deal with and reject the position, and I'm not even saying that it's true because it's a lot of philosophy. I'm just saying that we would need to see understanding of what's being talked about. And it's not even that it's not understood. It's like there's no knowledge of it at all.
It's like you having it's like you had this whole long, lengthy discussion on a major pressing issue that you're trying to understand. Everybody has had this discussion forever. It went on and on and on.
Yeah.
And on. And you have already established a system for analyzing this, established different theories, came to proper conclusions, dealt with it. And then some guy comes along and entirely ignores everything that has been said and just starts the discussion from the very beginning.
And says, I had a dream and everything you said is dumb.
Basically.
Let me ask you this question, see what you think of this. So the more I hear what we're talking about in regard to the rise of Islam originally, it's very parallel in many ways to Mormonism. And so Mormonism basically says all of the prior revelation has some truth in it, but it was also corrupted. Ours is the new final revelation, and you just didn't have the full consistency of understanding that God is actually three things. It's also ironic too that in Mormonism, God has the Father has a body, much like what we see in the Quran with the body of Allah and so forth. But their approach is now there's actually polytheism. I would argue Mormonism is ultimately polytheistic, but
yeah,
I mean, could we conceivably just counter the whole system with Mormonism? Because if the argument is, well, the Quran is preserved, well, maybe the books of Mormon are better preserved, you see.
Plus, aside from the preservation, you don't even need the preservation there. You could simply appeal to the fact that some guy comes along in the middle of a land where people are trying to figure out which religious beliefs to hold on to. This guy comes along and claims to receive revelations, and there are people around him who affirm that he is indeed receiving revelations. They affirm that he is of great character. They affirm that he is a fantastically pious guy who is entirely selfless. And Allah seems to be, God seems to be completely in agreement and basically in his service, and gives him these revelations, and he establishes the truth and declares that people corrupted his message. I mean, he's ultimately doing exactly what Muhammad did. I've heard a lot of people refer to him as the American Muhammad, or there are people who say. I spoke to a former Mormon here on this channel, a woman who is an ex-Mormon. I think her channel is called Ex-Molex, but she came on here just to also pleasantly argue that she did hear about Islam and how Mormonism is compared to Islam before, when she was a Mormon, and also afterward. And she was also pointing out that the way the revelation is seen, and the way Joseph Smith, yeah. Why is my mind going all over the place? The way he is trusted by Mormons in terms of his revelations, even if they seem completely absurd and out of place, is quite similar to the way Muhammad is trusted in Islam, when he brings outrageously weird revelations, or when he brings revelations that are just about him and his desires. It's quite similar to Mormonism, to the point that you bring up. It could be reasonable to go with that objection. And I have seen people actually argue against Muslims and say, why not just accept Mormonism? It does the very same thing. But then you get a very hypocritical answer from them, and the answer just revolves around, well, we know that that's not true because he was just all about his own desires, and then he just made up revelations. Well, you could say the same thing about Muhammad. Well, we already have the truth. Muhammad already brought the truth. We don't need anything else. Well, that's
the only way I could see them, just in terms of epistemology, making that work is that they'd have to say in a strict way that the Quran was the final revelation. But I mean, but aren't the hadiths also additional revelations? So,
well, what they do with that is they will say the Quran is the absolute final revelation. That is the truth. After that, no revelation can come, no prophet can come. The hadiths are different from that, because the hadiths are basically just sayings of Muhammad or actions that people around him noted that are not considered revelation. Everything that comes after him is absolutely unacceptable, absolutely false, and that's the answer that they will give you when you tell them, okay, Joseph Smith, he made a lot of claims. He said these religions in the past were corrupted, and he brings the truth. He
but wait a minute. So wait a minute, though. Let's expand that argument and say, well, but Allah apparently allowed divine revelation to be corrupted amongst the Jews and the Christians, right?
Yes.
So he allowed them to be deceived, apparently, and for the revelation to be corrupted. Hence, why we need the Quran. Why should we think that it's not also corrupted if Allah can allow the revelation to be corrupted?
Because the Quran is unique in that Allah had a plan of those previous scriptures being corrupted, and the Quran is unique in that this is the only book which Allah promised nobody will ever be able to corrupt, and He will protect it for.
Well, but my point is that the promises are in the older books too. Right. So, but wait a minute.
But you can't trust those books because those books were corrupted.
I know, but that's what I'm saying, is that the same promise of non-corruption was in the Torah. It's in the Christian texts, and Allah allowed us to be deceived then. How are we not in the same epistemic dilemma if we believe the Quran, that Allah might be allowing us to be deceived now. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but Allah wouldn't do that because, and we already know that those scriptures are corrupt, because when you read them, you will see that they are obviously not in alignment with pure monotheistic Islamic beliefs.
Yeah, but that's derived from the book that's in question. So yeah.
Well, if you go and look at those books, if you just look at the Quran and open your eyes, you will see that
you just use your eyes. You just look. See. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Somebody wrote a paper. I have to dig it up. I've got it saved somewhere. It was a couple of years ago, but they were arguing that Islam does argue that Allah is a good deceiver, right? And so if Allah is a good deceiver, then how are we able to trust at all any of our reading of the Quran, right? We might potentially be being deceived, right? Yeah. And so now all the propositions are potentially deceptive. And so we're not in any better position with the Quran than we are if we're a Muslim and we're looking at the Jewish and Christian texts, which also promise that they're inspired and not that they don't have errors, you see. So in other words, let's say I'm a 4th century Jew or Christian. The books that I have tell me that they're not corrupted and they're inspired and they're authoritative. But from the Islamic perspective, those books are corrupted and I'm basically deceived, right? And so I need the Quran to fix that. But Allah's already a good deceiver, and so why would I not think that the new revelation also is potentially deceptive? You can't just say, well, because it says it's not. Because the old books said they were not, but God was also deceptive back then, you see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there is a very funny, a very nice thing that you can add to that, which I love about Jesus and his crucifixion. Some flavor you can add to specifically that, which is so Allah is a deceiver. He says that he is the best of deceivers. Think about what the Quran says about Jesus. Jesus was he was sent down with a message, with a scripture. He was they denied him. They tried to crucify him. They tried to kill him. But they did not manage to kill him, not manage to crucify him. It was only made to appear that way. Okay, well, what happened as a result of that? As a result of specifically that, a major religion came into existence that is, according to Islam, a complete corruption of the truth. Right. And why did it come into existence? Because the people believed that Jesus on that day was crucified. And they saw him, I guess, rise, which is a deception. It was made to appear to them so. And that appearance, that deception, that illusion, whatever you want to call it, brought forth the largest religion in the world, which happens to be a completely corrupt religion. Is this Allah's plan? Did Allah establish a plan for Jesus where his death was basically a deception which brought forth the largest false religion in the world? So did Allah create this false religion on purpose by creating this deception?
Well, they would say, yeah, right. I mean, if you're hard determinist, right?
Yeah, and why would you blame the Christians then? See,
exactly. That's a good point.
Why would you blame the Christians then? Because it looks like Allah created the deception and they fell for it. So it's not their. Is it their fault? If Allah is the best of deceivers? So there you go.
Yeah, it's just maybe this plays into the pathology of that religion, right? Where, well, if Allah is the best of deceivers, is it possible that Muslims then welcome being deceptive?
Maybe.
I mean, what do you think? Do you think that?
I want to think deeply
about people. Do you think the taqiyya objection is that overused, or is that?
I think okay. That's why I'm thinking about this right now. But here's the issue: there is a lot of overuse of that whole taqiyya accusation. of saying whenever Muslims say something that doesn't seem to be true or that doesn't seem to be consistent, some people might say they're just doing taqiyya. I would say that is largely overused. Muslims do not learn actively to lie and to deceive and to hide the truth and all of that, and they don't learn about this concept, this idea called taqiyya, and that they're supposed to practice this. The problem with that is, and there's a lot of nuance to this, although taqiyya is usually a wrong, overused accusation, although Muslims don't actively learn to lie explicitly, Muslims do have a habit quite often of concealing uncomfortable truths or concealing certain things which they also lie to themselves about, and simply go to whatever makes it easier to convince the other side that Islam is true. And you learn this whole concept, which is that religion is supposed to be made easy. So when you try to preach Islam to somebody, make it easy.
Oh, I see.
Forget about the complexities. You can cover things that don't need to be mentioned. You can ignore questions that
So
are
it's a
raised.
more
Just
pragmatic
focus on-
approach.
yeah, just focus
Okay.
on whatever makes it easier for the other person to accept Islam. That's it. So while the accusations of taqiyya are largely wrong and overused, there is an element of doing whatever it takes just to make the other person accept that Islam is true.
Gotcha.
And that might include there is an issue here that might include occasionally using deliberate deception when you deal with people that you consider enemies of Islam, like myself, where they say they are basically at war with me and with enemies of Islam, and in war, deception is allowed, as Muhammad has said.
Makes
in fact, it is to be used. So that is part of that as well.
So there's not like any hadith that says, you may deceive your opponent explicitly.
No, there is nothing that says you may or you should lie to them. All there is that there is implied. There are words from Muhammad that deception is part of war, and there are just instructions on making it easier for people to understand Islam. So that's pretty much it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good. That clears things up. That's overused, like you said.
Yeah. I want to point at this thing here to simply revisit the whole issue of ignorance of pre-Islamic beliefs. So here is a whole narrative that is adopted from later Christian ideas, where Jesus speaks as a baby when he is born and tells people that he is Jesus. But what's very important here in that narrative is in Quran chapter 19, verse 30, it says, Jesus said, "Indeed, I am the servant of Allah. He has given me the scripture and made me a prophet." So I hear you already chuckling about this, about what it says here. But yeah, so the understanding here is that Allah gave Jesus a scripture and made him a prophet. And what's very interesting is that Jesus says this as a baby already.
Is what?
Jesus is saying this as a baby here. So he's speaking as a baby and he's saying, "I am a servant of Allah. Allah gave me a scripture and made me a prophet."
I have a note too saying that this is from that Syriac infancy narrative, right?
Yeah. And
what when that's brought up, I've not heard anybody address, like, is that ever addressed? Like, aren't these from prior non-canonical or pseudepigraphical texts? Like, is that ever addressed?
The answers you get usually are that people did have certain truths and falsehoods that survived throughout the centuries, and some of these stories that came.
So they don't have a problem admitting that these are older narratives.
Yeah. So they will just explain that away as some truths and falsehoods that made it through the centuries. Same thing with for example, there is an issue with chapter 5, verse 33, I believe, which is a prominent verse of whoever kills one person has killed all humanity. Okay, that's chapter 5, verse 32. It says there, we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or for corruption in the land, it is as if he had slain all mankind. And whoever saves one, it is as if he had saved all mankind entirely. And Muslims will often cite only part of this and will just say, whoever kills somebody has killed all mankind. Whoever saves someone has saved all mankind. The problem with this is, as it points out, we decreed upon the children of Israel. This is something that was apparently taken from Jews. And the problem with this is, this stuff here, whoever kills a soul unless for a soul, it's as if he had killed all mankind. And then the same with saving, is something that directly comes from the Talmud.
Yeah, I've heard rabbinical sources say this. Yeah.
Yeah, it is directly in the Talmud. The Talmud deals with this issue. It explains something from the Torah and then says what you can understand. So the rabbi says what you can understand from that is that if killing one Jew is like killing all of mankind, and saving
Right.
one Jew is like saving all of. So that is an idea that was presented by the rabbis in the Talmud. It is not something that was revealed or that was found in the Torah or anything like that. It is directly a Talmudic rabbinic explanation of
Interesting.
the Talmud. But here it is in the
Yeah.
Quran, directly presented as
from God.
as if it were from Allah revealed.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know about that one either. So, and Reynolds mentioned a couple of those, but I don't remember off the top of my head which one he said was Talmudic in terms of the source. So that would be one of them, though. That's interesting.
Yeah. What's also important to note here is that this is, according to the Quran, only a law for the Jews. So, and here's the next verse, just to make it very nice. Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive upon earth to cause corruption is none but that they should be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides, or that they should be exiled from the land. That is for them a disgrace in this world, and for them here in the hereafter is a great punishment. This is a horrible.
So is this why you see some of the radical Islamic groups doing this to people at times, including like crucifixion?
Yeah, and including there were reports in Somalia, for example, in the recent civil wars, where they were referencing this verse and actually cutting off the hands and feet from opposite sides of rebels.
That's what I thought. Yeah,
pretty messed up. Yeah, there's a lot.
Now, is that one from a prior source, or is that unique to the Quran?
That part about cutting off stuff, that is that is from the Quran.
Okay,
but that is just the verse after the one that is taken from the Jews, from the Talmud. So what probably happened there, the theory is what probably happened there, why the Quran suddenly has a Talmudic teaching there, as if it was revealed from Allah, is that Muhammad was in Medina. Medina had a lot of Jews, learned Jews. Jews interact with him and tell him things. And one of the prominent ideas and teachings they have is specifically that. Muhammad hears it and probably thinks, oh, Allah revealed this to them.
Yeah.
So it's then included as a revelation from Allah. But and that's just a big oopsie, you know.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of the narratives are maybe things that were heard and misunderstood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the Trinity Mary stuff. That sounds like something that was heard. Oh, they think this, you know, and it was recorded. Yeah.
Also, I mentioned in Quran chapter 9, verse 30, there is this Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. No Jew believes that Ezra is the son of God and worships Ezra, but it's probably something that he heard. I mean, maybe somebody joked. I don't know. Maybe somebody was joking about the Quran when he took it seriously and included it in
or maybe somebody was trolling him and like told him, yeah, we think Ezra, right? And then he wrote that down and like, so it was an ancient trolling.
Yeah. What's have you heard of the idea that Alexander the Great is also in the Quran? That's a very important thing. Look into that. There is a character named Dhul Qarnayn in the same chapter that also mentions the sleepers, the 7 sleepers, and it talks about a figure named Dhul Qarnayn, who is a servant of Allah and who was given all kinds of power by Allah and went to the very far ends of the world. And the issue with that character is nobody knows who that character is. The issue with that character is early Islamic scholars were very clear that Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. But over time, when people learned who Alexander the Great actually is, they began to deny that. And many Muslims today will still deny that because the Quran basically depicts Alexander the Great there as a servant of Allah.
Well, he was a pagan.
Yeah. And
Wow.
and what happens there, according to the Hadith, is people come. Apparently, Jews are coming and asking him about this, and he then goes away and comes back many days later with these revelations. But the revelations get it all wrong. This is Islam.
Yeah, maybe you heard, the text in Daniel or Maccabees, which reference that time period of Alexander.
Yeah.
And maybe he thought that meant that Alexander was a servant of God, which is odd because that's not at all what Maccabees says. Maccabees doesn't really comment a lot on Alexander. It focuses on Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Who's the one that defiles the temple. I'm just trying to think why he would have maybe.
There's an explanation of. So historically seen, apparently the early Jews had developed an understanding of Alexander the Great, where they, for a while, referred to him as somebody who was given power by God, or who was favored by God, because they had an understanding that people who become very powerful and who have great
divine
power on the
providence.
earth, they are given divine providence, and so they began referring to him as somebody who was gifted by God.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that he served God.
That's the issue, and Muhammad probably misunderstood that. So
exactly. Yeah. I mean, it says the same thing about Nebuchadnezzar. That when Daniel's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, he says that divine providence raised up Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah,
doesn't mean that Nebuchadnezzar was a servant of God. In fact, he was a blasphemer, and in the book of Daniel, he's punished because he's a blasphemer.
Yeah.
So, that's fascinating. I was gonna look and see how, because I know Maccabees mentions. I can't remember if it mentions them explicitly or if it just kind of mentions them in passing in the first chapter of Maccabees. But it's talking about that period. I don't think it mentions him by name.
Bing Cicero said, "Can you look at the errors of the Trinity in the Quran?" We did that. Thank you so much.
No, it does. Excuse me. So the very beginning of Maccabees does mention Alexander as king of Greeks. He went to the ends of the earth. He spoiled the earth like army spoils. He fell sick and died. Doesn't reference anything about it, just states it kind of like a history of Alexander, and then it moves into talking about Antiochus being a horrible blasphemer because he was one of the 4 generals that took over after Alexander passed away. Alexander reigned for 12 years, then he died. His servants took over and ruled in his place. One of those was Antiochus. So there's never a positive mention in Maccabees, just as a curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I will quickly put this here on the screen just because it's so funny. So here is the Quranic narrative on Dhul Qarnayn. It says in 1883, and they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn, and Dhul Qarnayn literally means the 2-horned one in Arabic.
The what? The 2-horned one?
Yeah, 2-horned one.
And, that might actually be a reference to Daniel.
Well, the thing is, so if you look at this, if you look at the narrative here, it very much copies ancient myths, the legends about Alexander. It basically copies the Alexander Romance legends, and Alexander the Great was known as the one who wears a helmet with two horns, and there were coins that existed in Arabia as well at the time, where Alexander the Great is depicted as somebody with two horns. But it says here, "I will recite to you about him a report. Indeed, we established him upon the earth, and we gave him from everything away. So he followed the way until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it setting in a body of dark water, and he found near it a people. And we said, O Dhul-Qarnayn, either you punish them or else adopt them a way of goodness." Here's a very interesting detail. He found the sun setting in a pool of dark water. He said, "As for one who wrongs, we will punish them. Then he will be returned to his Lord, and he will be punished with a terrible punishment. But as for one who believes and does righteousness, he will have a reward." Then he followed another way. When he came to the rising of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had not made against any shield. And then he built for them a wall to protect them. But this is basically goes back to old legends about Alexander the Great, who allegedly traveled to the very, very east and very west, and who built a giant wall to protect these people from these invaders. And
yeah, but you'll find this interesting because if you look at Daniel 8, like verses 5 to 14, a lot of people think that it's, whether you think it's a prophecy or whether it was written later, it's talking about Alexander, and it's calling him the horned one, the goat. It calls him the male goat, I think, here, and in verse 5. So what's funny about that is that the description is that he's an evil pagan ruler in Daniel, but he's called the horned goat, the horned one.
Yeah.
And he's likened to a goat, which in scripture goats are typically referred to as the wicked sheep and goats. So I'm just pointing out that it's the Quranic narrative. If he heard this story from Jews, or if he'd heard Daniel and thought maybe that was about Alexander,
maybe, or that could be how it developed.
But what's funny is that in Daniel, he's the wicked person,
and that's where the issue is. He just hears bits of knowledge, probably from the Jews, from others, and then he thinks, "Oh, I have a revelation from Allah. Allah says so and so and so." And
but you're saying that he, in this passage about this figure here, that it's actually calling him a righteous person, right?
Yeah, no, it's literally, according to the verse, it's Allah communicating with him and making him a judge over people, whether they are righteous or not.
And you're saying that initially the Muslim scholars have said it's Alexander, but now they don't, or there's debate.
Some still say that it's Alexander, but
Okay.
most of them nowadays deny it. But it's in early Islamic history, the interpretation of this was very clear that this is a reference to Alexander the Great.
Yes. So it's another example of just something being misunderstood. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would do now? Do they say that it's just some unknown ruler or something?
Yeah, most likely they usually say that it's that we don't know who it is.
Okay. Interesting.
But that's also very funny because there's just some guy mentioned here, Dhul-Qarnayn. You have no idea who it is. That's it.
Yeah. The horned one.
Yeah. Plus, he also builds a wall here that is supposed to prevent Gog and Magog, also a narrative taken from the Bible and previous beliefs.
Well, that's interesting because that's Ezekiel, but there's no reference or explanation to what Ezekiel's talking about.
But here it's like he builds a wall, and Gog and Magog are these beings, these corruptors, these
workers of corruption,
and they are behind that wall, and they are to this day still trying to get through that wall. And one day they will make a hole into the wall, and they will invade the whole world. And basically,
wait. Now I'm getting, this is blowing my mind. wait, what is this? Sounds like the plot of what was the Avengers, where the aliens like they're making a hole in the sky, and remember they come through the portal? Is that what we're talking about?
Something like that. I've never watched the Avengers movies, actually, to be very honest. But
so wait a minute, what does this mean? This hole in a wall, and they're trying to get through to this day? What is it? Or we don't know what it means.
We do. I think there's I don't want to explain it myself. I would like to let Muhammad explain it to you.
Is this in a hadith about that?
Well, it's also here in the Quran. It is, but it is more in more detail described in the hadith. So here it is. It mentions they said, "O Lord Karnain, indeed Gog and Magog are corrupters in the land. So may we assign for you an expenditure that you may make a barrier between them and us." And he does that. He builds a huge wall, and it says, "So they were unable to pass over it, nor were they able to penetrate it." And then it further says, "But one day." Wait a minute, it will be blown, it will assemble them in an assembly. Yeah, one day they will get over it.
I guess, like, is this a literal wall, or is it like some spiritual reality where they can't?
I'm going to now invoke Muhammad here. Here is Muhammad, according to the hadiths. It says, the Prophet got up from his sleep with a flushed red face and said, "None has the right to be worshipped but Allah. Woe to the Arabs from the great evil that is nearly approaching them. Today a gap has been made in the wall of Gog and Magog like this." And he makes a number. It was asked, "Shall we be destroyed, though there are righteous people among us?" The Prophet said, "Yes, if evil is increased." So it is actually a wall, and they're trying to dig through that wall. But it gets even better. It gets even better.
This is bizarre.
It is. It is very bizarre. Very, very bizarre.
Yeah, it says the afflictions of the end of the world. So does that mean that this wall and the hole that they're trying to dig has been going on from that?
Yeah.
Okay.
It gets very, very ridiculous. So this is a description about the end times, and it says he mentioned Dajjal. He said, "I will descend and kill him. Then people will return to their own lands and will be confronted with Gog and Magog, people who will swoop down from every mound. They will not pass by any water, but they will drink it. By anything, but they will spoil it. The people will besiege Allah, and I will pray to Allah to kill them. The earth will be filled with their stench. And the people will besiege Allah, and I will pray to Allah. Then the sky will send down rain. Then the mountains will turn to dust, and the earth, and this and that." Okay, there's one description, but there's even more. It gets very bizarre. It gets very, very bizarre. So it describes. If I go back to the things here. Gog and Magog, Gog and Magog.
Are these strong hadiths?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bukhari is always
Okay.
strong, very reliable. Some of them are from different sources, but they're also marked as Sahih, authentic.
Okay.
Gog and Magog dig every day until when they can almost see the rays of the sun. The one in charge of them says, "Go back and we will dig it tomorrow." Then Allah puts it back stronger than it was before. This will continue until when their time has come and Allah wants to send them against the people. They will dig until they can almost see the rays of the sun. Then the one who is in charge of them will say, "Go back and we will dig it tomorrow if Allah wills." So they will say, "If Allah wills," then they will come back to it and it will be as they left it. So they will dig and will come out to the people and they will drink all the water. People will fortify themselves. They will shoot their arrows toward the sky and they will come back with blood on them. And they will say, "We have defeated the people of the earth and dominated the people of heaven." Then Allah will send a worm in the napes of their necks and will kill them thereby, and so on. And then there will be a beast of the earth that will be let loose. This is all stuff.
Interesting. So this is another layer of what I would say from the Christian biblical perspective of kind of cobbling together things in Ezekiel that are kind of mysterious. And but I mean, there's nothing. You know what? There's a text in Ezekiel where Ezekiel is talking about the Jews who were engaged in pagan worship and that they had dug out under the wall of the temple a secret place where they were worshiping like pagan gods. So that's famously the same book where we get Gog and Magog from the latter chapters of Ezekiel. I'm just speculating. I'm thinking that they might have heard stories from Ezekiel about digging through the wall, and then Muhammad is creatively kind of cobbling this together and saying, this is an end times narrative of a wall that the Jews and other
Mhm.
people try to dig through. You see what I'm saying?
Interesting perspective.
Just speculating.
In the end, we cannot know what exactly happened there, but as pointed out, there are lots of references in the Quran where it continues saying, and they say that these are just stories of the old. They say he hears what he believes whatever he says. So these are Quran verses about Muhammad, and these Quran verses basically tell us that the people around him kept accusing him of taking stories from others, from people around him, from
Yeah.
believing whatever people say, from making things up, from of being crazy, and so on. So it's we can speculate, but it looks like he just got a lot of myths and some true stories, some falsehoods, some complete misunderstandings, and mixed them all together and presented them as revelations.
Well, we
Whether
have a lot of, I mean, that end times kind of stuff there. I mean, I've spent many years researching and reading and looking at evangelical approaches to end time stuff.
Mhm.
And I see a lot of parallels there with that, where they'll kind of cobble together a bunch of very ambiguous, Old Testament passages, especially Ezekiel's latter chapters about Gog and Magog, and it gets kind of cobbled together in this jumbled narrative that, oh, it's talking about Russia and it's talking about the end of the world in China. And I mean, I don't know what the end of the world is going to be like, but I don't think that the evangelicals going to have the they don't know what they're talking about, is what I'm trying to say. And
Yeah,
I sense the same kind of extremities and cobbling together with Muhammad in those passages that we see, for example, evangelicals doing with passages from Ezekiel.
eschatology is a very, very interesting, very enticing thing, right? To people, it's so talking about the end times, talking about the tribulations, all the stuff that will happen is something that people are always fascinated by. It's also a very easy topic. I can imagine that in the 7th century in Arabia,
It would
where
play well with an audience.
where people do not study much, do not know much, don't know anything, it is very easy to get everyone's attention by talking about the end times and all the fantastic stuff that will happen then. And it's quite believable that Muhammad got his fair portion of that, of all of that, and then turned that into a revelation, which he then presents to his own audience because it works so well. And there we have it.
It would be interesting to see a similar type of breakdown of the conceptions of Antichrist, Dajjal, and all that kind of stuff that you were referencing. The way that you were talking about how, to Christianity, the resurrection has a really significant role. Antichrist is not as significant, but it does play a key role in some of the apocalyptic texts of the Bible. I'm curious. I'd be interested to see in what way it's misunderstood or sort of cobbled together in Islam, because I didn't know about those hadith passages there, which are fascinating.
It's funny. Dajjal literally means deceiver or something along those lines. The actual long form name is Masih al-Dajjal, which is the false Messiah, the deceiving Messiah. It's directly adopted from Christianity, but then presented in a completely different way. And in Islam, the narrative is basically that the Dajjal, the false Messiah, will come at the end, and he will basically claim to be God. Very interesting stuff. He will claim to be God, and he will raise people from the dead. He will kill somebody and raise him from the dead, and he will be so.
These sound like, I mean, that sounds like Paul in Second Thessalonians, and it sounds like chapters of Revelation.
Yeah, and he will claim to be Allah, and people will follow him because he will be so amazing. But the true believers, they will immediately recognize him and they will not follow him. And then at the same time, Jesus will come down from the sky as a Muslim. And yeah,
So this is cribbed from the Apocalypse.
yeah, and he will basically fight the Dajjal, and then pray together with the Muslims. And according to the Hadith, he will come and break the cross and kill the pig. And
break the Christian cross.
yeah, break the Christian
Who's
cross.
the pig?
The pig is just kill. It says kill the swine. That's what Muhammad says.
Oh,
Kill,
just any
kill,
of the
kill the
any of
pig.
the
Yeah,
okay.
he just kills the pigs and for no reason. And
Wait, literal pigs or like the people are called pigs?
no, it's literal pigs. So he comes and
Surely you're joking.
he will come and he'll be like, "Don't eat this." I don't know why exactly he's gonna be. He's
Oh,
gonna be doing
because
this.
pork's unclean.
I guess so, but it's so. What Muhammad says is he will come and he will break the cross and kill the pig. I will prove to you that I'm not joking about this.
I guess I just keep wanting giving the benefit of the doubt and think, well, surely they mean like the swine symbolic of evil people, but you're saying actually just kill pigs.
Yeah.
Well, I guess at the end of the world, those pigs do have to get dealt with. I mean, like,
yeah, somebody has to do something about this. But,
kill the pigs. Well, okay, there you go. Wow.
Yeah, so Allah's messenger said the hour will not be established until the son of Mary descends amongst you. As a just ruler, he will break the cross, kill the pigs, and abolish the jizya tax.
Do they have like explanations of, oh, this symbolizes the unbelievers or something? Or
I haven't looked in length into this, but
Okay.
I know that it's like the explanation is just that it's actually pigs, and the cross is actual cross, as
Okay.
in he will literally break it to confirm that the cross belief is false.
false? Okay.
Yeah. So these are the priorities of Jesus when he comes back. He
Well,
will
I
kill
guess
pigs.
if Jesus does descend and break the cross and kill all the pigs, I guess I'll have to be a Muslim at that point. That happens, right?
Especially if you see him kill the pig, you're like, wow, I can't believe that was actually correct. So
Wow,
that's messed up.
that's crazy. All right, I mean, really instructive and insightful talk. I always enjoy talking to you. It was really funny too, by the way.
Same.
Thank you for all that insight there. You always learn from you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I loved the debate that you had. It was like your opening was an education for Daniel, and then he came and just messed it all up with his very primitive approach to scripture. So mad respect for that as well. And I'll always be happy to have you here, Jay.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. I'm glad to be back on, and anytime you want to chat again, I'm down.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a fantastic day. I'll see you soon, and stay away from Islam.
All right, thanks, man.
Yeah.